All right, folks, welcome to the 12-Minute Leadership Series. My name is Pittampalli, and today we have a really important topic, which is how to deliver bad news. Now, leaders have the unenviable obligation to be able to deliver bad news to people in the organization more often than we'd like. And, we're not talking about always absolutely devastating news, kind of like the worst news that you can think of. Sometimes we're forced to give somebody really negative feedback or a negative performance review, for example, that can be considered bad news, right? It could really ruin somebody's day, their week. It could demoralize them. It could sap their motivation. These are all times where we could benefit from understanding how to deliver bad news in a way that reduces the impact, right? Not in a way that reduces the message, right? Because that's our job as a leader, is to be able to communicate that bad news in a way that's comprehended. But often, the way we communicate bad news creates unintentional harm, unnecessary harm. So one of the places, one of the arenas where this is understood the most is in medicine. So obviously, doctors have to give patients some of the worst news of all, the kind of unimaginable news that fortunately we don't usually have to deal with. But what we found, or what they found in medicine, is that for years and years, doctors were unintentionally doing more harm than they needed to when delivering bad news, because they weren't given any type of training. And as a result, years later, they were able to understand that there's a way to actually deliver bad news in a way that reduces that unnecessary harm. And one of the people who has actually pioneered this movement to reform the way doctors deliver bad news is a guy by the name of Dr. Robert Buckman, who invented this protocol. It's called SPIKES, which is an acronym, which is the basis for this webinar. What I've done is I've taken Dr. Robert Buckman's work, the SPIKES protocol, and I've kind of adjusted it for the business setting so that we can learn the best from the medical world, but in a way that makes sense for our specific needs in the organization, okay? So what I want to do is I want to tell you 8 steps, okay? 8 steps for delivering bad news. And at the end, I want to answer your questions. So remember, this is an interactive webinar. If you have questions throughout this webinar, submit them in the little box that you have in your GoToWebinar widget, and I'll try to get to them after we're done with the session. So let's get started here. Let's start with the 8 steps for delivering bad news. Step number 1, choose the right setting. Now, part of this is pretty obvious, right? You want a setting that's going to give you privacy, that's going to provide minimal distractions. So obviously a private room, some place where not other people are lurking and viewing. That's what the person who's receiving the bad news deserves. But also we have to think about the difference between one-on-one and group communication. So sometimes we're put in the position where the bad news applies to an entire group, and we have the choice to hold a meeting and deliver the bad news in front of the entire group. Sometimes that's appropriate, but oftentimes it might not be, right? Maybe you need to have one-on-one conversations with people if the bad news really warrants it, right? That's going to take a lot more time, but sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it makes sense not to have everybody one-on-one conversations with everyone. Maybe there's just a few people, for example, 2 people that you think are going to be particularly affected by that bad news. Well, maybe you want to have one-on-one conversations with them and do the rest of the communication for the rest in a group setting. So there's no right or wrong answer here. The point is, the first step is really choosing the right setting, being deliberate about it, thinking through the scenario in your head and trying to determine, is it better if I have a one-on-one conversation or a group conversation? Step number 2, begin by listening. Now, delivering bad news is not often pleasant, obviously not for the receiver, but often for the sender too. So one of our instincts is to do it as quickly as possible and just kind of get it over with. That can be a bad instinct, because what you want to do is you want to not get right down to business. Okay, that you want to show people that you care, and getting right down to business and launching into the bad news too quickly can be perceived that you don't care, and you want to battle against that perception. So a little bit of small talk and a little bit of questions that elicit answers will help in the beginning. Ask them how they are, ask them how they're feeling, for example. That will get them start talking, and you don't want that to continue on forever, just a short amount of time, but just getting them talking will start to diffuse the tension that's inevitably going to be there. Okay, step number 3. What you want to do is you want to ask about perceptions. This is an important step here because your delivery, your method of delivery, your style is going to be dependent on how bad the news is going to be received, right? So you want to try to get a sense of that beforehand. So here's how you get a sense of it. You have to realize that the severity of the news is going to be defined by the gap between the reality of the situation and their expectations, okay? So for example, if you're about to give somebody really bad feedback, really harsh feedback regarding, their quality of their meetings, for example, and you know that the reality is over here in terms of their performance, and their expectation, on the other hand, is that they're fabulous at meetings. Well, you see, that's a really big gap, and that bad news is probably going to be received poorly. And therefore, you may want to be a little bit more delicate. You may want to take a little bit more time. You may want to build up to the bad news. As opposed to if, for example, you're about to tell them that they need lots of improvement in meetings, and yet when you ask them for their perception, they already know that they really need a lot of improvement in meetings. Well, then that gap is smaller, and that might make for a more direct approach where you want to kind of just launch into the bad news a little bit more quickly, okay? So assessing their perceptions is critical for determining how exactly you're going to present the information. Okay, step number 4. This is kind of like a very high ROI suggestion. Step number 4 is forewarn the bad news. It's such a simple thing, but giving somebody a few moments to prepare for the bad news so that it doesn't come as a shock or surprise is actually pretty important, right? So for example, instead of just launching into the bad news, you can say something like the following. Unfortunately, I have some bad news to tell you. Now, that may not sound like much, but it turns out that these few moments allows people to psychologically brace for the bad news. They can kind of physically and emotionally prepare themselves, and that helps them actually grasp that bad news in a way that's not as devastating. So this is actually, it's something that's so easy to forget, but if you just give them a few moments by forewarning the bad news, you will help the process along immensely. Number 5, you want to communicate in small chunks. So when you're delivering bad news, what you have to realize is that this is going to create almost certainly a state of high arousal, emotional arousal, right? When people hear bad news, they're going to kind of get into that fight or flight mode. And this is going to reduce their ability to comprehend the news. So you actually have to kind of talk to them slower and in more bite-sized chunks. So for example, if there are 3 components to the bad news that you need to get across, if you jump into all 3 all at once, they may not really comprehend all 3 because of the state they're in. So what you want to do is you want to go slowly. Start with component number 1, then take a moment, right, to let them get their bearings again. Then 2, then 3, right, and using a little bit more of a slower pacing to make sure that they're comprehending every single one of these chunks, because comprehension is crucial. That's the whole point of this meeting. You want to deliver the bad news in a way that they get it, that they really understand it. Number 6, use empathic responses. So for some reason, a lot of managers feel like they're supposed to be cold robots, right? Like they're supposed to have this emotional wall where managers are not supposed to be able to show emotion. They're just supposed to get the facts out and then get out of there. I don't know when that trend started, but I think it's been going on a long time. But really, the best thing to do is actually to show empathy, right? You can't change the bad news. That's not your job. But what you can do is you can show empathy for their response to the bad news, right? So here's how you form an empathic response. Here's the formula. You identify the emotion, right? So let's say they're sad. That's the emotion. Then you identify the source of the sadness. which is obviously the news that you're telling them, maybe a specific part of the news, and you connect them to get together. You say, I'm so sorry, Mary, it seems like that part of information A is causing you to be sad, and I totally understand it. Just by connecting those two together, it sounds simple and obvious, but it makes them feel like you care. It makes them feel like you've acknowledged those emotions. Number 7, which is crucial, the 7th step is to validate their feelings. So empathy is about acknowledging the emotions. Validation is about letting them know that the emotions are okay. So if somebody is visibly upset, or if they're crying, or if they're obviously feeling negatively based on this bad news, part of them is probably going to feel embarrassed, right? Especially because in the workplace, you don't feel like you're supposed to cry or supposed to show emotions. And that's not what you want. So you want to show them and tell them that it's okay. Tell them that, listen, I know you're really upset right now, Joe, and I just want to let you know it's totally understandable. Anybody who receives this bad news would behave or would feel the same way. So you're validating those emotions, and which is critical. And then finally, step number 8 is to summarize the bad news. Okay? The whole point of this, again, is comprehension. You want to make sure that people get the bad news in a way that's not as devastating as it needs to be, not unnecessary harm, but they need to understand it. So at the end, recap with them. Make sure, maybe get them to restate what the bad news is, so that way you know that they've received the bad news in the way that you intended it. Okay? Not worse than it is, not better than it is, but as it is. So those are the 8 steps to delivering bad news. I know it's not an enviable task to deliver bad news, but with these kinds of steps, you can actually make it tolerable and not any worse than it has to be. My action item for everyone here, because this is such an important skill, is to role play this. I want you to find somebody to help you and actually role play this. Pick like a fake situation where you're delivering bad news, somebody who's obviously a friend or a colleague of yours, and go through these steps with them. This is what they do in the medical community, and it turns out this role-playing actually works really well, preparing you for the next time. So good luck delivering bad news. If you were here for the 12 minutes, I'll see you next time. Otherwise, I'm going to go into the box now and see if we have any questions. So again, right now is your chance to ask any questions that you have about this topic or anything kind of related as well. So I'm going to go in here and see if there are any questions. One moment. Yeah, somebody is asking about, Hillary is asking about Buckman's strategy, his protocol. And what I will do is, in the follow-up email, I'll actually link to his 6-step protocol, which is called Spikes. And it's actually it's a fascinating protocol. And what I've given you is kind of an abbreviated, customized version. But I totally recommend going to the source and seeing the steps. Again, some of it is not going to apply perfectly because it's largely for the medical world, but I will certainly link to some of his work in the follow-up email. But if you just search for Buckman Spikes, SPIKES, which is an acronym, you will be able to find it. Okay, Andrew has a question, which is, can you repeat number 3? Okay, so number 3, I'll go over this really quickly again. It's ask about perceptions. Okay, so again, you want to find out where they're starting, right? Like, what do they think what do they think about the bad news? Do they even know bad news is coming? And if they do, what is their perception of the bad news, right? Like, if they have wildly differing expectations compared to reality, that's going to make for some pretty devastating news. If somebody thinks that their performance has been amazing over the last quarter, and your performance review suggests that it has not been amazing, in fact, the opposite, that gap is going to create a lot of dissonance. So you want to know that going in. That's why you're asking them. So, for example, you might just start out by asking the question, I would like to tell you a little bit about your performance review, but Rohit, what do you think? Can I ask you, what exactly do you think about your performance? So you're asking for their perceptions of how their performance is, and now that you know what their perception is, you can kind of customize your delivery to make it fit their perceptions. Okay. Somebody has a question. They want to recap number 7, which is validation of feelings. So Number 6 was using empathic responses, which is largely a tool to acknowledge their feelings, right? You're trying to get them to understand that I get it. I acknowledge that you're feeling this way, and I totally understand it, right? It's about making people feel heard and understood. Validation, number 7, which is the next step, is one step further where you're basically making them understand that it's okay. It's totally human and understandable you feel this way. This is critical, I think, in a business setting, because in a doctor's office, it's the norm to feel terrible, right? That sounds like a horrible characterization, but it's true, right? I mean, you get a lot of crying in the doctor's office. You get a lot of negative emotions in a doctor's office. In the business world, you don't often get that, right? In an organization, people feel like they need to be completely emotionless. And so your ability to basically validate those feelings and make them not feel ashamed for having these emotions is critical. So you may say something to the effect of, I can see that you're obviously upset right now, and I just want to let you know, Tim, that it's totally understandable. Anybody in your position would feel this way, and I just want to let you know that it's totally okay. Okay? And so just that little bit of encouragement, it goes an incredible long way to making people feel like you care, which is one of the goals of this entire webinar. Okay, so Rebecca asked the question, how can this approach be scaled down for less severe news? Thanks for the great webinar. Well, thank you for the feedback. So this is a protocol that you can use for any news, right? Even less severe news. So obviously this works, this is kind of optimized for kind of news that's a little bit more severe. But even when it comes to, see, here's the problem is a lot of times there's this wishful thinking that goes on in organizations where nobody likes to give bad news, right? I mean, leaders don't relish in that kind of activity. So even if something we know, if something might be received kind of badly, we convince ourselves that it's not really bad news. It doesn't warrant this, a private setting, a 20-minute one-on-one conversation where we're actually talking through this because, this kind of stuff happens in organizations. All of the data suggests that is not true. It turns out that human beings are much more sensitive, men and women, than we think, especially in the workplace. I mean, everyone on this webinar, I'm sure, has the experience of somebody like your boss or a colleague telling you something and just really not feeling very good about it, and it ruining your day or ruining your week. So don't underestimate the severity of the news that you have. You want to be cautious, and you want to assume, give yourself a buffer. If you think something is kind of like mildly inconvenient news, assume that person might actually perceive it to be a little bit worse than you think. And these steps will apply even to news that's a little bit less severe. Obviously, it may change depending on how severe the news are. You may want to spend less time if it's less severe news, or you may want to do less empathy or less validation if the person is visibly not as emotional. So this can be customized, but just, err on the side of caution when delivering bad news. Okay, let's see here. One other question is, and this will be the last one, is should you offer solutions, Steve asks. That's a really good question. I mean, it obviously depends on the situation. One of the things that comes after the summary, kind of step 9, is often, where do we go from here? Like, what is the next steps forward? Usually when it comes to feedback, hopefully you have, next steps, you have solutions, right? Because that's what feedback is. It's specific improvements for suggestions where you offer somebody kind of options to move forward. So I think that's a very critical point, Steve. When it comes to that type of bad news, you should really, people are going to feel at a loss if they don't know where to go next. And remember, because they're in such a highly emotionally aroused state often, their ability to be creative and to think about the future is going to be diminished. So your job as a leader is to point them in the right direction. So I would have an action plan and a solution, some recommended solutions in mind to point them in the right direction, depending on the situation. Anyway, That's all our time for today. Thanks for attending this webinar. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to let me know by email. I actually hopefully just added a survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. So I would love for you to fill out that survey because it helps me gives me feedback, and I don't take bad news very seriously, at least this kind of bad news. So if you have critical comments, that's great. If you have constructive comments, there's something you like, let me know. I really appreciate the feedback. Helps me make these things better. Thanks for attending this webinar, and I will see you next week.